It's my distinct honor to introduce our next presenter. Comes to us from Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. This is Pascal Haegeli. He's a professor there, and he leads the Avalanche research program. And he doesn't do, as he would tell you, the avalanche mechanics, but he does what I think is even more difficult, is he does research into writing and understanding avalanche forecasts. You know, what do you read, and does that actually translate into you making good decisions? So it's a challenging field, and Pascal supervises some other PhD students, and we're working towards being better at writing, and hopefully you all being better at understanding what the forecast means. Hopefully I got that right. Pascal, it's great to have you here. Here you go, bud.
Now we're here. Well, thanks very much for the introduction, Lynn. And thanks to everybody here in the audience for coming out this morning. It's a great pleasure for me to be here at WYSAW. I've heard lots of good things about it, and so I'm very excited to be here and get the opportunity to present my research to you. For people who don't know us at Simon Fraser University, I just want to give you a quick overview of who we are. What you see here is a beautiful shot of our campus. We're just right outside of Vancouver in British Columbia. And I supervise a team of roughly between 8 and 10 grad students. And we do a variety of different research topics. We're currently the only avalanche research program in Canada. And so we're trying to serve the industry. And so we do snowpack modeling to help with hazard assessment. We do avalanche terrain modeling to help to better communicate how severe the terrain is that people get into. And then we're also doing this risk communication research to try to come up with better methods to actually communicate avalanche hazard to the team. Our home at the university is the School for Resource and Environmental Management, which is a little bit different from kind of traditional avalanche safety research programs that are typically in engineering or earth science, for example. And so the fact that we're in the School for Resource and Environmental Management means that we're kind of focused on this management component. And all of our research projects are basically at this interface between the natural sciences and the social sciences, because you need to understand the system, but you also need to understand the people who interact with that system to really make a difference. Now, before I talk about the research, I just want to acknowledge that Simon Fraser University and my research program are located on the unceded and traditional territories of a number of First Nations, which includes the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, the Coquitlam, and the Musqueams. We decided to start all of our presentation with a land acknowledgement like that, because it's just a small but hopefully valuable contribution to truth and reconciliation to try to make this a more just world for everybody. Okay, so let's get into the topic. We want to talk about what works in avalanche forecasts and what doesn't. In order to be useful, an avalanche forecast has to kind of do two different jobs. On one side, it has to represent the conditions in an accurate and consistent way. And on the other side, it has to communicate that assessment in a way that's accessible and understandable and relevant to the end users. In the past, a lot of research has been done on this first part, trying to make these forecasts more accurate and more timely and better. And so our focus has been primarily on this second part. because the best forecast is worth nothing if people don't understand it. Even if it's super accurate, that doesn't really help much. So our focus is kind of like, how do recreationalists understand and use and apply the forecast? What are users' needs and expectations? What are common hurdles that make it challenging for users to actually use the forecast? And the overall objective of our research is to help Avalanche forecast centers to create a better product that basically lands better with the users. We use a variety of different methods to study these questions. Sometimes we have recreationalists come in and kind of do one-on-one interviews and give them exercises to do. We work quite a bit with online surveys because it allows us to sort of sample a much larger audience. And then sometimes we stand out at trailheads and interview people right there. Each of these methods have kind of their strengths and weaknesses, but together they're able to give us sort of a fairly comprehensive picture of what's actually going on. Now, for this presentation, I'm going to focus on results that we've got from surveys. And over the last, I think, probably about 8 years, we've done a bunch of them. And what you see on this slide here is all the different questions that we've tried to address in these surveys. So we started with kind of looking at the danger scale, at different ways of presenting information, how people use the information, how valuable that kind of like the forecast discussion is, and what are people actually able to understand. Now for this presentation, I'm going to focus on two particular questions because, as I said, kind of the main audience of our research are actually the Avalanche forecast centers, because we're hoping to give them tips about how to improve their tools. But these two questions actually also have some valuable insight for the users themselves. So I'm going to talk about these two questions in detail. So let's start with the first one. How is the danger scale interpreted and used for trip planning by forecast users? Here's a screenshot of the North American Public Avalanche Danger Scale, probably very familiar to everybody in here. 5 levels, 5 different keywords, 5 different colors, and on the right-hand side here, you see the definitions of the different levels. A similar scale is getting used all around the world. The 5 levels actually originally came from Europe. It was kind of a consensus among different countries in the 1980s. Before that, different countries had different scales. I think the French had 4 levels, the Swiss had 7, the Austrians, I don't know, had 9 or whatever. And so they all came together and came up with this consensus. And it was actually a hard-fought consensus. And some people actually lost their job over this. But today we have this 5-level scale. Now our question was, like, how severe do people actually think conditions are at the different levels? And to get at this, we created this question format, and it took us a long time to come up with this format. So we created these slider question, basically. So we asked, for each of the 5 levels, use the 2 sliders to indicate the severity range associated with the conditions from a scale from 0 to 100. 0 means no avalanche hazard at all, and 100 means kind of like the world is coming down, like big avalanches all the way down to valley bottoms. And so people filled this out. And then we used fancy statistics to try to find out different patterns in these answers. And what I'm going to show you now are the different patterns that we found. In total, we found 7 patterns, but I was just going to show you 4, the 4 main ones. what you see on this chart here, we basically rotated these sliders around. So you have at the bottom on the x-axis, you have the danger rating, and then on the y-axis, you have that severity scale. The black line shows kind of like the midline through all the different ranges, and the ranges show where people put those sliders on average. So in this particular survey, we had about a little bit more than 2,000 participants. About half completed the question with a pattern like this. So it's kind of a linear pattern, and the ranges are the same for all the different levels. Another pattern that we found was this one here, also still fairly linear, so it's a straight line, but you see that the ranges differ. So the range was widest for considerable, and then it was smaller for low and went back to smaller for extreme. We also found this pattern, this kind of convex shape, so where the difference between the levels was highest at the bottom, and then it flattened out as we got to extreme. And the last pattern that I want to highlight is the opposite. It's a concave shape where the difference between the different levels actually increases as we go up in the scale. So my question now to you is, which of these patterns is actually the right pattern? I'm not going to put you on the spot to raise any hands or so, but you can just think yourself, which pattern do you think is actually the right one? Now let me show you. This is a chart that was published by Jörg Schweitzer a couple of years ago that basically shows avalanche activity or the severity of the condition as a function of the danger level in a small area in Switzerland. And what you can see here is that as the danger level goes up, the severity actually goes up exponentially. So it has this concave shape. And so the reason for this is because 3 different measures are all growing at the same time. And these 3 different measures are the ease of triggering is increasing as we go up on the scale. The number of locations where avalanches can be triggered goes up as we go up on the scale. And last but not least, the size of the avalanches go up as we go up on the scale. And since all these 3 things are growing together, we have this exponential increase in the scale. Now let me quickly go back to the other, let's take a little bit longer. You can see here that only 6% of our sample actually knew what the right shape is of the avalanche danger scale. And so that highlights that there's potentially a miscommunication between how scientists and avalanche forecasters perceive that scale and how recreational users perceive that scale. And if we have a communication issue here, people potentially make the wrong decisions based on that scale. Okay, let me go back to here. We also asked people, how do you actually use the danger scale of the different levels for your trip planning decisions? And we gave them a number of different options. Do you just primarily go out based on the danger scale alone? Do you primarily go out based on the danger scale, but you also check other information? Other information is critical for my decision-making process. Or is the danger rating alone actually preventing you from going out? And what we found out was that 2/3 of our sample actually treated high and extreme the same. They basically don't go out under these conditions anymore. And if 2/3 do that, then the question arises, do we actually need 2 different levels up there? And would it be beneficial to actually reduce that scale to 4 levels and make the communication easier, because that would actually bump considerable to the top half of the scale instead of having it in the middle. Okay, let's quickly summarize the results here. So the perception of the scale might be different between scientists and end users, which is a problem. The linear interpretation might simply be the most intuitive interpretation of the scale, and trying to convince everybody that this is actually an exponential scale might be a bit of an uphill battle. As I just said, we also saw that 2/3 actually treat high and extreme the same, and therefore is it really useful to have that 5th level on the scale. So let me bring it back to this graph. So basically the things that we have to think about is, for whom is this information actually important? Like, who in the recreational audience actually bases their decision on the danger scale? And once we've identified this group, we have to make sure that the tool actually works the best for them. A danger scale can't really serve the entire community with all of their different needs. So we need to really focus on who is this targeted to and who can we design this to the best possible way. Yeah, how can we make that information more informative for the intended target audience? Okay, let's move on to the second question that I want to present you with here, which is about how is the danger rating actually used in trip planning and combined with terrain information to make informed choices. For this, I have to briefly introduce you to the Austrian format of the avalanche forecast. This is a survey that we did in Austria, and so some of the things might not be super familiar to you. This is the general format of the forecast. You will recognize a lot of the different things. We have the avalanche danger scale up here. Then we have the avalanche problem information here with the aspect and elevation. And then we have a forecast discussion here at the bottom. One of the main differences is that this elevation information here is not static like it is in North America, where we have the 3 different elevation bands. They actually specify specific elevations for where they draw this boundary. Another aspect is that the danger scale also then follows this kind of elevation information. And one of the rules that they have is that the danger scale outside of the areas where the avalanche problem has been identified is by default 1 level lower than the indicated danger scale at that level. Okay, so to find out how people use this information and combine it with terrain information, we created this exercise. So we gave people an avalanche forecast, and then we gave them a relatively simple landscape, and we identified 4 different slopes on here, and we told them how steep those slopes are. Aside from steepness, we told them that these slopes are all the same, they're all the same size, they have all the same kind of exposure, they have no exposure to overhead hazard, and so on. But so we primarily wanted them to focus on steepness. And the question was, use the drop-down buttons here on the right to indicate or to rank those 4 different slopes according to their risk. And use the highest risk at the top and the lowest risk at the bottom. So I'll give you just a minute to sort of think about how would you solve this exercise. Now, to solve this exercise, there's a few things that people need to know. So first of all, they need to know that higher risk goes along with higher danger ratings. They need to know that rule that outside of this core area, the danger rating is actually one level lower. And they need to be able to relate this aspect and elevation information actually to the map. And if you do this, you can find out that there is two slopes that are actually within this core area. They're on the northerly and northwesterly aspect here. And there's two slopes that are outside. One is below 2,000 meters, and one is on a southerly aspect. The next thing you need to know is also that steeper slopes are generally riskier than less steep slopes. Now, if we create an exercise like that, we also need to have a proper solution. And in Switzerland and Austria, the graphical reduction method is one of the main decisions tools that are promoted for recreational backcountry users. And it basically gives you this graph here on the left where you can combine the danger rating with the steepness to come up with a decision or an assessment of how risky the conditions are. And we can actually put those four slopes on there, and this results in the following solution, where you basically have slope B is the riskiest slope up here, and then we have C, D, and A. So if I get it right here, slope B is the riskiest, then we're going over to C, D, and A. Now this is one way of approaching this. Another way of approaching this is to do it sequentially. And I apologize for the German here on the slide, but this is the first time that I actually present this in English. So, if you do it sequentially, there's two ways of doing that. You can first separate the slopes according to the danger rating, and second, according to the steepness. That gives you a particular solution. Or you could do it the other way around, and you separate the slopes by steepness first and do it by danger rating second. And that gives you a different solution. In this particular case, the graphical reduction method and the second sequential approach actually give you the same solution. Now for this particular scenario, this is all the solutions that we got from participants. So you can see here, these are all the different response options. And this is the number of times we got that particular response option. And I've colored the options in here according to what approach that they actually used. So the green one, which was about a quarter, a little bit less than a quarter of participants, they actually gave us the solution that we were looking for. The yellow one was the sequential solution where they separated the slopes according to the danger rating first and the steepness second. Then we had a whole bunch of response patterns where they followed a systematic way, but they made some errors. They either missed some observations or they only did half of it and so on. And then we had the red ones where I couldn't really figure out what they did. Now, I just gave you one of these scenarios. In total, we had 6 different scenarios, and with different combinations of avalanche problems and so on, and different danger ratings and so on. So what I'm going to show you next is kind of the main takeaways from all of these different scenarios. What we found out was only that about 1/6 of the participants actually did the solution that we were expecting them to do. So only 1/6 followed this kind of promoted decision-making approach. More than half of participants used the sequential approach, where they split the slopes first according to the danger rating and to the steepness second. Now, it's encouraging that people use a systematic approach. Unfortunately, this approach didn't always result in a meaningful solution because moderately steep slopes are by definition actually not avalanche terrain. And so by definition, they're not really threatened by avalanches. And so this resulted not in the right solution. Another thing that we found out, which I thought was quite interesting, that in the scenarios where we had an aspect-dependent danger rating, there was a good chunk of people who simply ignored that information. So that begs the question, is it actually useful to share that information with people? Because I know for forecasters, it's actually incredibly difficult to do this in a very reliable way. Often there's big question marks around the aspect information. The last thing is also kind of like in certain scenarios, people interpreted additional information into our scenarios. They basically interpreted additional things that we didn't intentionally give to them. So for example, for wind slab avalanche problem, they also focused exactly where I put this dot in the elevation, and they basically considered slopes at higher elevations to be more affected or have higher risk, which makes total sense, but to me it highlighted you really have to sort of clamp down on what you present people with in these exercises that are very specifically designed. Now, before I finish up, I want to quickly talk about these qualitative terms that the Swiss and the Austrians actually use for describing the steepness of slopes. So how steep is actually a moderately steep slope or a very steep slope? And the European Avalanche Warning Services actually have specific definitions for this. I hope you can read it from the back there. Moderately steep slope is less than 30 degrees. And then steep is 30 and above, very steep is 35 and above, and extremely steep is 40 and above. And so we were curious whether people actually know those definitions. And so we asked them, what do you think are those bounds for these definitions? And what you see on the slide is the different distributions that we got. And on the right-hand side, I summarized these distributions. And I sort of said, like, if you were within 2 degrees, you got it right. If you were below that, your estimate was too low. And if you were above that, your estimate was too high. And the interesting thing here is that as we go higher, people generally overestimated where that boundary is. They thought that the terrain that the forecast was talking about was steeper than what the forecasters were actually talking about. And this is a bias in the wrong direction. This will make people go in steeper terrain that they should. And so the lesson here is kind of like, don't use these qualitative terms. Just tell people how steep the terrain is that you're talking about. With these qualitative terms, you unnecessarily make your avalanche forecast ambiguous. Okay, let's summarize it up. The main result here is that applying forecast information to terrain is difficult. And I think there is great potential here to design decision support tools that help user actually do this step. There's a number of decision tools along those lines in Europe where, based on the avalanche forecast, they rate each potential trip and give it a hazard or a risk rating. And then you can just go on there and pick the trips that are marked green. There's a number of challenges with these tools too, but I think they have great potential to make it easier for people to apply the available information. Also, I already said, kind of qualitative terms, there's some challenges with that, and it's a lot easier or more straightforward to just give people the straight goods. Again, we have to think about this specific information. Who is it actually intended to be used, and can we simplify or can we design it in a way that it very specifically addresses the needs of that particular audience? Okay, So these are kind of the main results of these two research questions. I'm just quickly going to go through what we found out with the other ones. What is the best way to present aspect and elevation information? You saw in the Austrian avalanche forecast, they have separate icons for elevation and aspect. In our study, we found out that the American aspect elevation roses are really the best way to present this information. It's much easier to interpret that information and to apply it to the terrain. We also looked at the forecast discussion. How useful is that discussion? Here we found that it's most useful under considerable, which makes sense. That's kind of the most challenging conditions that they're out there. The most variety of conditions fall under that considerable label. But we also found out that people think it's the most difficult to actually understand what forecasters are talking about under considerable. So there is a lot of space for improvement there to really get the message across under those challenging conditions. We also found out that in terms of terrain and travel advice, the advices that are the most tangible, that help people understand how to apply the information to the terrain, are the most useful. And they're the most useful when there's no jargon in it. So as forecasters, we don't need to make ourselves sound smart by using jargon. It just makes it harder for the other side to actually understand what we're trying to tell them. And then last but not least, we looked at how people actually navigate through the products. And we found out that it's actually independent of conditions. It's just different types of users either read the full thing at all times, or other users just look at the danger rating and that's all they do. I think that was actually quite an interesting result. Okay, conclusions. Just back to kind of like, we want to think about kind of like, who are our users and how are we communicate to them in the best possible way? I think we need to accept that there is a wide variety of users and they use our products in different ways. The product should be designed for those specific users who actually use them or who actually depend on them for their decision-making process. We want to carefully design them, and research like this can really provide practical insights for those design decisions. Traditionally, most of these decisions have simply been made by Avalanche experts who thought like, this is what the users need. But one objective of my research program is to kind of bring the user perspective more into these decisions. Yeah, we don't need to get too much in that. Or actually, like, if we kind of trying to evaluate the usefulness of these tools, we don't just want to ask, do you like it? We actually explicitly want to see, does it actually affect your decision-making process in the right way? Okay, we've already talked about that. And then I think one thing that we have to keep in mind with these survey results is that our sample is often dominated by more advanced users. And if we see problems in there, these problems are probably even more pronounced with users with less experience. Okay, I want to quickly thank all the Avalanche forecasting centers who have worked with us on this. It's been a pleasure to work with them and sort of see their curiosity for how to make their products better. I want to thank all the survey participants. By now, there's been thousands, and maybe there are some of them here in the room. Without your help, it wouldn't be possible to do this type of research. If you want to stay connected and learn more about the research that we do, we have a website. We have an Instagram account that I'm trying to keep alive, but I'm lousy at it. And you can also always email me if you have any questions or suggestions for new research projects. So with that, I'm going to finish up. And if there is time for questions, and if I didn't completely blow my time slot, then I'm happy to take them. So thank you very much.
We definitely have time for a couple of questions, but I see
question over there in the
Don,
back.
I see Don. Is that Don on the top row? Yeah, go ahead, Don. Maybe, can you fling?
pretty far.
Can you get that?
Yeah, Don's got it.
I'll repeat it. Go ahead, Don. Hang on, Don's question is, we've been using 3 tiers for the experience level of our advisory users. Is that appropriate?
Yeah, I think it's a great starting point. I think we simply want to learn more about what those tiers exactly need and how we can package it in the best possible way. We recently did a study on snowshoers about avalanche awareness around snowshoers, which we would generally put into tier 1, kind of people who just look at the danger rating and then decide whether to go out or not. When we interviewed snowshoers and winter hikers at the trailhead, I think it was 75% who didn't even know that an avalanche forecast existed. So there we even need to kind of use another avenue to get the awareness into them in the first place. So I think there's, I think 3 tiers, they're good, but there's lots of gray in between, and maybe there's additional opportunities in there.
Great. One more question, and then we'll break.
There's one over there.
Oh, great. Is that Simon?
Hello. Hey, Pascal. That was awesome. Question 6, how do users navigate through the avalanche forecast components? If I understood you correctly, you didn't find a trend like with trickier conditions or different danger scales. You found that people kind of had a habit and they would do one thing or the other regardless of the day. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was correct. That was the stronger. We used Anne Sinclair's Avalanche bulletin typology, that kind of identifies different types of users, of how much they engage with the product in general. And that was the stronger predictor of how they used it than the conditions. Like, we gave them different scenarios when we asked them. Yeah, so that's correct.
And was that just in Europe, or is that North America as well, or what was that data set like?
That data set was just in Switzerland and Austria.
Okay.
So I don't know how it would transfer over here. They've now kind of equipped their website to actually see how people navigate through it. The advantage that we have in our data set is that we have all their background information. We know how much experience they have. We know how often they go out, how they typically read the forecast. And so it gives a slightly different or richer perspective than just kind of Google Analytics that you get on your website.
Cool, thanks.
I'm going to call the questions right about there, and I throw out, just since I do have the bully pulpit here, and throw out that I encourage you to not just look at the color or the number of the forecast of the day, and realize how much work and how much research goes into the writing of the forecast itself and the danger ratings. So,
I second that. But as a forecast center, you also have to accept that there are people who just look at the color and then go out. So there are an audience that is using our products, and maybe not in the way they're intended to be used, but there are users like that out there.
we're very fortunate to have Dr. Haegeli come and join us. Thank you, Pascal.
Thank you.
Great. We're going to take a 15-minute break. During our break, I encourage you to buy raffle tickets. Last I heard, we were up to $25,000 worth of raffle prizes. So, yeah.